Christine Dickson, welcome to the Journey on podcast.
I cannot even put into words how delighted I am to be here. I think I've had 25 podcasts with you in my mind in the last few days, so let's just do one for real.
Let's do it for real. Now, I'm so looking forward to this. We haven't had a lot of conversations. We've had a little bit of interaction recently at a clinic in LA. We kind of hung out afterwards and for both days actually and chatted quite a bit. And I was like, oh my God, this lady needs to be on the podcast. You have so many amazing stories to tell. But I met you at a horse expo in Pomona.
Yes. 2017, I think it was, yeah.
Is that when it was?
Mm-hmm.
Because we're in LA, I actually thought you were an actress.
Yes, you did.
You look a lot like, what is that lady's name?
Kim Dickens. Kim Dickens. Yeah.
Kim Dickens, and your name's Christine Dickson, and we met. I'm like, I think she's an actress, but yeah.
Well, that was the funny thing because I walked up to your booth and you were like, "Hey," and I was like, looking behind me, and I was like, "Oh, he's really friendly."
I've seen you in Deadwood.
Yeah, that was a funny conversation.
It was a funny conversation. And then you came to a clinic in Arizona.
Yes.
A couple of years ago. We chatted with you there a little bit. And then I think I've run into you one other time. And then when you came to the clinic recently, we got to chat some more because you are the amazing person who introduced me to Dr. Will Su. So, that was actually we can actually probably talk about that.
Sure.
So Will was on the podcast before. He's a therapist who, I don't know, would you call him a specialist in?
Yeah, he's a
psychedelic-assisted
psychiatrist
therapy?
who specializes in, using psychedelics in healing.
And I got to LA early on the Friday, the day before the clinic, lunchtime. So I drove over to Will's house. We went down. He lives at Venice Beach. And so he took me for a bit of a tour around Venice Beach, walking around. That's an interesting area. That's if anybody from around the world has ever seen, like on TV or whatever, Muscle Beach in California, that's where it is. It's at Venice Beach. So yeah, I spent the afternoon chatting with Will and talking about different things. And I invited him out to the clinic the next day, and he sat with you during the clinic, and yeah, you could probably tell the story of what went on his head, but you told me by about 11 o'clock he had to go home and take a nap because his mind was like, the clinic was kind of cool because what was going on with some of these horses were non-communicative. Like there was one there that was very quiet, shut down, had been a former Western pleasure horse, and the lady said, I can't get him to move. I can't get him to go, ask him to move on the ground easily. Like it's like, beating a dead horse with a stick sort of thing. Not that she was beating the horse. And she also said, he kind of doesn't show anything. Like he's got no itchy spot. Like he won't show me an itchy spot. And after a little bit of messing with him, I had his head turned upside down, his top lip curled back, going, oh my God, that's the coolest itchy spot ever. And then I started working on asking him to move, and pretty soon I could get him to almost move off my energy. And what was cool was Will got to see all that. And maybe you can tell me what you guys were chatting about while that was going on.
Well, what was really, I think that one of the things that Will does, which I do when I go to your clinics too, is that there's always the correlation between what you do with the horses and what you do with people, or what the issues with people are. So I think that he was looking at it a lot too from the standpoint of what was that horse's owner going through in that moment, and what were they, and how does what you do with the horses also translate to people and energy. And the whole thing with that was you were just asking the horse, is this okay? And giving him a little scratch. And if he showed any concern, you took your hand away. And then you did that just really briefly 2 times to just say, like, look, I'm not going to push you to do something that you're not ready for. And then by the 3rd time you did a little scratch is when he was like stretching and lip curling. because it was like, okay, like I trust you. And that just, I mean, that's like a universal thing, right? So if you don't have that, if you don't have that trust, then you don't have much in any relationship. And he just
Yeah,
felt like it was so much information. I mean, he's always taking everything in that, like, I think his brain was melting after a little bit. He's like, go home.
yeah. So the poor guy had to go home and take a nap. But yeah, he came back the second day too. So it was so cool to, um, it's such an honor to have him there and be interested in what I was doing. But then we had a bit of a chat later. I think maybe a couple of days later or something or other. But just drawing the parallels, I did a clinic in Texas one time, and there was a guy watching, and I left the arena to go to the restroom or something, and he stopped me and he said, I'm a trauma therapist, and he said, this stuff you're doing with these horses is trauma work. And I think most horses that have been around humans much, that's the first step, is unraveling the stuckness, unraveling the trauma stuff before you can get to what you'd actually like them to do, because they're not a fully functioning mammal, like their nervous system's stuck in certain places. And, that's the relationship part for me, that's the relationship part of the whole thing that allows the training part, when you get to that, to be easy. But trying to train a horse with all that stuck emotion and that stuck trauma in there is why horse training appears to be problematic. Oh, my horse won't. I can't get my horse to. My horse does this. And it's not something you got to address there. For me, it's go back and unravel why they are like that. And when you get through that, they're all very, very willing to do whatever you want,
Well, like, and I know that this is something that you've talked about, is once you're in the nervous system, the brain is not functioning, right? So if a human is over threshold, right, or a horse is over threshold, like, they're not in their wise mind. They can't make choices and be articulate and, figure things out. It's just, what do I need to do to feel safe in this moment?
Yeah, it was very cool. Anyway, so we probably should get into, what do you do? So you are a sober coach and a clinical hypnotherapist. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's funny because I was just talking to someone about this, and I know that you've talked about this, which is, it's so hard to quantify in some type of title, what I do, what a lot of people, that colleagues and people I know do, because it's kind of oozed out of the constraints of what people think of in a certain title. So I the best description, I believe, is a transformational mentor. That's what I've landed on, is a transformational mentor. I do coach, but coaching is just a thing that I do within that construct, right? So I use hypnotherapy too, because if we can get the subconscious on board with the changes and the things we want to do, then we're ahead of the game, right? And then I use the horses because a lot of times, and this happens over and over, is that it's hard for people to integrate the intellectual knowing of what they know to be true or right, or what they've been told about their issues. But being able to be around the horses and to be able to, like, project it onto the horses, or see how it relates when the horses relate, all of a sudden that can just, like, all the little pistons and things click in together, and it makes sense because they can view it outside of themselves. In something like a horse, see, people trust animals so much more than humans, because we could all come with, like, judgments and, all of our ideas about how things should be. And horses are just honest. They're just completely in the moment, and they tell the truth.
So you just jumped to the horses right there, and we haven't talked about that part. So you use horses as part of your transformational coaching?
Yes.
A lot, a small part?
depends. Everything depends on the client, right?
Okay.
I have had clients that told me they were terrified of horses, that, I mean, just absolutely loved them after one session. And some people,
Well, can I ask?
yeah,
Sorry, can I ask you about that?
yeah, of course.
Is it because, and I think this is what happened at the clinic too, because that's what Will really made me think about. Is it because the story they've been telling themselves in their head about what horses are and what they would do to a human? You know, they're a rather large animal.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're quite a bit bigger than us and way more powerful. And do you think it's because they just assume a horse is like a defensive creature who's going to kick me or bite me or run over me or whatever? And do you feel that part of the transformation is shedding that idea, like coming away with a different impression or different thoughts about that? I mean, I know I'm kind of putting words in your mouth here, but yeah, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I do. I there's definitely a big piece of that. I think the other piece is that, especially as adults, if we're entering into something new and we don't have the tools, like we don't understand what is the language of, the language with a dog and the language with a horse are completely different, right? So if I don't know, oh, what does that mean when their ears go back? Or what is it? Like, I have no idea where the boundaries are, what is good, what is bad with this huge creature. So, and maybe they've had a bad experience in the past because they weren't protected, or they weren't, nothing was explained to them. And everyone's always so afraid of doing things wrong. They don't want to get it wrong. They don't want to look stupid. They don't want to get hurt and feel embarrassed. So I think that if you create a really safe space and make it like, you can't do anything wrong here. We're just meeting these horses out here, and they're all very loving. Like I'm lucky I have like very like goofy loving horses. So once they feel that, like, oh, patting a nose or giving some carrots and laughing and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, this is really cool. And I think that people are so attracted to horses because, what, I really deeply feel like the wildness of them, the power of them speaks to something in us, something that maybe we can't even put our finger on, but that power and like seeing a horse running and like free is just, I don't know, it makes my heart, like my chest constrict a little bit. And so I think that tapping into that helps us tap into that little wildness inside of us too. Like, what is in there that could be bigger and could be out here?
I think it was Jane Pike, and I'm not sure if it was on the podcast.
I love her, by the way.
I love her too. She's one of the coolest human beings. I can't imagine you and her in the same room together.
Oh my God, I would love that so much.
Exploding. I remember her saying a few years ago, I'm not sure if it was on the podcast or just when I was chatting with her sometime, but she said something about a lot of people are afraid, like say to canter a horse or whatever, like she deals a lot with rider mindset, and a lot of people are afraid to canter a horse, and it's not the speed, it's the power. And she said a lot of times it's because they're afraid of their own power. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it was like, whoa, that was quite profound. But the reason I was asking you that question is because, in the clinics, I'm working with the horses. I'm trying to unlock the horses. And so that horse that we talked about a minute ago that was, quite shut down, not interested in communicating with humans, but the human knew that my horse is numb or dull, and he doesn't have an itchy spot. 3 minutes later, like I said, his head was turned upside down, his lip was curled back, and he's like, oh my God, that feels good. So we started communicating. And then when I started working on the groundwork, it didn't take very long where he could just I could just move him quite easily with my body language and energy. And for me, I thought, so, there you go, I've helped you with your horse sort of thing. But Will said to me, he said, I was looking at the person, and he said I think he said something about seeing the change in them when they change the story in their head. Like, so right then, this lady came to this clinic and she says, my horse will not move on the ground. I basically cannot get my horse to budge. My horse won't budge. And also, my horse doesn't have an itchy spot. Mm-hmm. And that was the story they were telling themselves. Mm-hmm. And then, the itchy spot showed up first. And then after that horse started to communicate with me, then I got to where the moving thing was. And so she has this story about this horse for a long time, that my horse is numb and dull and doesn't have an itchy spot. And all of a sudden you've just flipped the script, and she probably got to reflect on the fact that my horse is those things because of the way I have showed up and interacted with this horse. Mm-hmm. And it was like, wow, I probably hadn't looked at it as much in that side. And that's probably happening a lot in clinics, and I'm thinking about trying to help the people understand their horses, but I hadn't really thought about, wow, there's a story she's had about this horse that is completely different. And and I've had those things with whatever, I've done it publicly for a few years now. But the thing is, when you get the switch flipped like that, then you're going to get to question yourself, well, what other stories am I telling myself?
Yeah, exactly.
About whatever.
Mm-hmm. And are they my stories, or are they ancestral stories that have been passed down in my family that I didn't even know were in there? I didn't even choose them. They're just there. I want to say that one thing.
That could be my next rabbit hole, because I was talking to someone recently who said they've been doing ancestral trauma therapy. Mm-hmm. And they gave me the name of the lady that does the ancestral trauma therapy. I'm like, and what was interesting is this person comes from another, what we call a Commonwealth country, so a country that falls under the British, not necessarily rule, but Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, whatever, all those sorts of countries. And his heritage is a lot of Irish in there. And so my father, I've got a German last name, but I've looked into our family's history. My father is 5/8 Irish, a quarter English, and an eighth German. And if you think about the Irish, were almost, white slaves sort of thing. And, they've been, so it's like, ooh, that's another rabbit hole to go down.
Mm-hmm. And the drinking. I mean,
well, why do you think they drink so much?
Exactly.
What are they?
All the
what are they numbing?
Mm-hmm.
What are they numbing?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. It's funny. I did my 23andMe too, and found out I was like 20% Polish, which no one knew. But yeah, Irish, German, Polish. I really, really wanted to be Native American, but I have 0.05%. So.
It's funny, talking to the stories you tell yourself, Robin's mum had always told her that she was 1/32nd Chippewa Indian. So Chippewa Native American.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because Robin's mum had been told that she's 1/16th Chippewa. Mm-hmm. And Robin's mum did I don't know if it's 23andMe or the other one, but it
Ancestry.
came back. Ancestry.com or whatever, but it came back that Robin's mum is not 1/16th Native American. She's actually 1/16th African American.
Interesting.
And it's interesting, where did that story come from? Robin's mum was, she knows she's 1/16th Native American, because I've been told that somewhere back there was a Chippewa in the thing, and it actually was not a Chippewa. So that, that's interesting.
Oh,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, I was just going to say that
Go ahead.
I recently, it's funny because we take on a bit of our identity from the stories too, right? And I recently, through 23andMe or Ancestry, got hooked up with someone on my father's side. And, my father left when I was a baby and my grandmother raised me. And, but I was told stories, obviously, about that side of the family. And I was, my actual last name would have been Schultz because I was told that my grandmother remarried. And so that my grandfather Schultz was a boxer that died of a ruptured spleen in the ring. And that my grandmother remarried to a man who owned a bunch of shopping centers named Dickson, and that he adopted my father. And that's how we ended up with the name. Well, through this person, I found out that none of that is true. My grandfather Schultz died of a heart attack at home. And then the Mr. Dickson, who my grandmother married, he drove a cab. He did not own a string of grocery stores. And it's so funny because I was like, wow. Yeah, like there was parts of me that kind of, I can imagine those are kind of romanticized stories, like my real father was a boxer, died in the ring, it kind of, and then no. And I think that depending on the person, it depends on how shocking those things can be to you, right? How much they're attached to your identity. Luckily, that wasn't true for me because I didn't really know that side. But yeah, it's very fascinating.
Yeah, very fascinating getting into that stuff. Why don't we dig into your past a little bit? So, you're now a transformational coach, but the reason I labeled you a sober coach and a clinical hypnotherapist because you actually mentioned those two things the last time we were chatting.
Yes.
So what's the story? How do you end up at this point in time? And I'm going to guess, because I think everybody I've met that does something along the lines of what you've done, you've done your own work and found it. This is just a guess. You've done your own work and found it to make your life completely different and wanted to share that with others. That's my guess. But you can tell me your story. How does one end up being a transformational coach?
That was a really good summation. Yeah, how does one? I could not have planned being a transformational mentor if I tried. Back in my 20s, I met a woman who became a mentor of mine. And she said to me, you're either on the path or you're not. And I choose to surround myself with people who are on the path. And not so much as a judgment, because we're all in our different places, right? But what she meant by that was it's not about whether you've reached some kind of destination. It's, are you fascinated? Are you really interested in being a person that looks at yourself and goes, why do I think that way? Or why, and interested in other people and the world and the way we're connected. Like, are you on the path of trying to be integrating with life and figuring things out and curious and see it as an adventure? And go ahead.
I was going to say curious is the word I was thinking of. Mm-hmm. Are you curious?
Are you curious? And that really hit me because I realized I had been on that probably my whole life up to that point. I was only in my mid-20s, and that's why when I started my business, I named it On the Path, because that's the most important thing. The most important thing I think is having a curiosity about, why do I feel that way? Or why do I think that way? Or why do I think that person said that? Maybe they have some pain inside of them. I don't have to take that personally. Having that curiosity and that openness.
And that was in your 20s?
Yeah, that was in my 20s.
Well, before we started recording this podcast, you said something. In my 20s, I was in New York taking acting classes. Tell me about what were you doing in New York and why were you taking acting classes?
I think that a lot of people who look at want to be an actor. I know for me, I'll speak for myself. Like I wanted to be an actress because not just the creative part of it, but I think the two things that really attracted me was this psychological part of like figuring out characters and figuring out, how people relate and how they act and how they think. And then, of course, the other part, which is like massive amounts of validation. That would have been great, like I really, the attraction to be validated on a large scale.
That's one of the questions I was going to ask because, I know if I've talked about it in the podcast, but I've talked about it to a number of people. Like my life is kind of weird to where I'm now kind of in the public eye quite a bit. And I was, I wanted to be a horse trainer. And I suppose wanting to be a horse trainer, part of that being a horse trainer was, and especially competing in, say, the reining, is you want to be known by those people, those peers of yours. You want them to think of you as whatever. You want that validation there. Mm-hmm. But then you get to a point, like when my life took a strange turn to where, now I'm in the public eye a little bit, at least on social media. It's not that mm-hmm. It's not that big a deal. But there's a number of people, quite a few people, might know who I am and have opinions of me or whatever. And it's an odd place to be because I have said this before. If you grow up and you think you want to be a football player, or you want to be a baseball player, or you want to be an actor mm-hmm. or an actress, or you want to be a rock star, you know that if I get good at what I do, I am going to be in the public eye mm-hmm. on a large scale. And I've kind of ended up in the public eye on a small scale, but it's not something I expected to be. But then I get to questioning, like, so why mm-hmm. am I here? Like, why do I want to be here? Is it that external validation? What is it? Like people, or even if horsemen who give clinics, what is it? What is it they want from that? But anyway, getting back to your actress thing, like, mm-hmm. that's one of the questions I wanted to know, why the actress thing, because I'm sure in reflection now you can probably look back on it and see deeper meanings in what you were seeking from that. And you just said, what was the word you used? The
massive amounts of validation.
Yes, that massive amounts of validation.
Well, because I think when we haven't gotten to the place of knowing yet, we think that if we get the external validation, that means we're okay, right? We're not going internal to do that work. We're going, well, if everyone else loves me, I must be lovable, right? If they all think I'm funny and great and want to hang out with me, then it must be true. So I'm okay. And I think it comes.
But you're only okay because they tell you you're okay.
Right. And let me tell you, they can turn on you. We've seen it. So if, there's a big danger in putting that in other people's hands. There's a great book, and I think I told you about it, called The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. And he explores, Buddhism and, Stoicism and all these different principles and how they affect, relate to life and the human struggle. And he told this story about this. I'm bad at remembering names sometimes, but it was a very famous new pitcher on a baseball team that was like the Cinderella story star pitcher. And he just signed a huge contract. And then he couldn't pitch. He was like in his head, all this money, all these people looking at him. He couldn't pitch. And what happened was he worked with someone who basically told him, you have to let go of your attachment to the cheers. because you can't let go of the pain of the boos if you still need the cheers, because they come together. So how can you quiet all of that out and have no attachment to that? And he worked on that, and that's what got him back. Like now they all goes away, because they're two sides of the same coin, right? It's like Brene Brown says, right? You can't just stop down the bad feelings. If you disconnect from feeling, you disconnect from all feeling.
That baseball thing right there, that was amazing. I tell you what, funny story related to that. I was at a horse expo in Scottsdale, Arizona a few years ago. And on the Sunday night, a few of us got invited out to a horse trainer's place on the outskirts of Scottsdale for a barbecue. So we go out there, and this guy's got this beautiful, he trains rein cow horses, but he's got this beautiful big house. And we go through his beautiful house and out to this big patio area at the back, and we're all sitting around drinking a beer or whatever. And then this guy walks around the corner, comes in the backyard, like he's the neighbour or something or other, you know, and he walks in, and they introduce us to him. You know, he's wearing like sweatpants, and he's carrying a 6-pack of Coors Light, you know, puts it in the cooler, got a baseball cap on. And he sits down there and he just joins in the conversation. And I had blown some tyres on the horse trailer there, going there, and I was talking about the horse trailer I had in the, you know, I don't forget how old it was, but I blew one tyre and I went to replace it. They don't make that tyre anymore, so I had to replace 5 tyres on the horse trailer. So we just got chatting about that, and he was saying, yeah, when I'm hauling things, I'm on hauling horses or whatever, he talked about his tyres or what he does. And so I figured, he has horses. Anyway, we're just hanging out with this dude. And at some point in time, I go in the kitchen or something, and they say, you know, that guy's a professional baseball player, just signed a $23 million 5-year contract. I'm like, really? I'm like, yeah. So anyway, I'm back out there. Him and I were chatting before, so my wife and I were out there chatting with him, actually, and I said, so you're a baseball player? He says, yeah. He said, so he was the starting pitcher for, I forget, but Scottsdale, Arizona is where they all do the spring training, so that's what he was doing there. I forget who he played for. And I said, so where'd you go to college? I don't know much about the American sports thing, but I do know that if you're a Major League Baseball player, you obviously got drafted, you know, went to college, got drafted, whatever. And he says, oh, I didn't. And I said, well, how are you a Major League Baseball player? Because you got to get drafted, don't you? You got to get drafted out of college. He goes, no, I got drafted out of high school, actually. And I'm like, is that a thing? Like, you can do that? And he said, yeah, you can do that. And I said, so where'd you go to high school? And he said, I'm from Texas. And I said, where'd you go to high school? And he named this town. I'm like, where's that? And he said, it's kind of halfway between San Angelo and San Antonio. So it's in the middle of nowhere. And I said, how big a town is it? And he says, about 4,000 people. And then, pardon my French listeners, but I says, how the fuck do you get drafted into the majors from a town of 4,000 people in BFE, Texas? And he gave me the greatest one-line answer I've ever heard. And I got to remember what it was now, how it goes. He said, because I never believed it wouldn't happen. And I told that story at a clinic in England a few years ago. And there was someone in the clinic who is a poet, who is an Oxford graduate and a poet. And she said a double negative is way more powerful than a positive. I never believed it wouldn't happen.
Right. I never even put that together. That was a double negative. Yeah.
Yes. I said, how do you get drafted into the major leagues and get a $23 million contract out of a high school in the middle of nowhere, Texas? And he looked me in the eye and he said, I just never believed it wouldn't happen. And it was like silence. There's nothing. There's no more questions left to ask after that.
But I really believe, look, when you have that kind of tunnel vision, I don't think it necessarily comes from an an intellectual thought, right? Because I could think right now, like, I want $1 billion, right? But I'm not really attached to that. Like, if I was money motivated, I would be working in finance, right? It's not that money doesn't play a role, but it's the idea that with what he was doing with his manifesting is that he saw it, felt it, integrated it, he knew it. It was like breathing for him. And I think that that comes from, you know, the universe a bit. Like there's a whole, like, what is your destiny? I think, and having that conscious choice too. When they meet together, it's how to manifest a car crash, right? Like,
Right. You know, driving home from there, Rob and I were thinking, that might be our next tattoo. I just never believed it wouldn't happen.
I've had moments like that in my life too. Like, there's only a few that are that clear, but yeah.
So you were telling us about somehow we got, you got onto the obstacle as the way. You were talking about the baseball player, which that story was amazing. I got to get that book now. But you were talking about acting in New York.
Yeah.
Oh, then we got talking into the validation of the masses. Yes.
Well, you know, the other thing is, I think a lot of people who go into acting and people who go into any type of healing work, dealing with, you know, whether it's therapist or, you know, working with people with horses or whatever it is, I think that people who have had trauma and pain are the people that gravitate towards being on that path and wanting to understand and also wanting to help other people on their journey as well.
It's the wounded healer archetype.
Exactly. I mean, when I went to school for clinical hypnotherapy, was the first thing that they said. One of the things is they said, you know, the people that gravitate towards this work are also the people that need it the most.
Do you remember the podcast with Sarah Schlotti from Canada?
I'm not the best with names, so what was the...
Okay, so she's a trauma therapist, but one of her mentors early on said, the reason you get into the work can't be the reason you stay in the work.
Yes. And it believe me, it does evolve. There was actually, you know, in 2020, my business exploded in 2020 because, you know, when everyone's in lockdown and all these people I'd worked with in addiction, you know, being isolated is not a good place. And I was lucky enough to build my whole business on referrals. So I had people referring people. Because I had the fear of lack, right? I took everything. And I kind of burned myself out towards, you know, going into this last summer, because I took everything. I was on call on everything, like 24/7, flying around with clients, traveling with clients, going to people's homes. Like I was working a lot. And, you know, I think that I was afraid for a minute that, oh, wow, maybe this was all just me working out the fact that my mother was a very bad alcoholic, and I couldn't save her, right? I could never change her. I could never do enough to fix her. And maybe I'm burned out because I've played that out with so many other people now that I've kind of healed that part of myself. And maybe that's why I'm burned out. Like I literally had this like, oh my gosh, like what if I've just reached a point where I can't really do this work anymore? And it reminded me of a story that I learned about Marlon Brando. That Marlon Brando was a method actor, and whenever he had a scene that he had to cry and be emotional in, he would use the memory his brother had died, and he would use the death of his brother to be able to cry. And one day he had to cry in a scene, and he tried to use that and it wouldn't work. And what he realized was that he had so completely grieved his brother by using it over and over again that it wasn't grief in him anymore. He didn't reside in him anymore. And luckily for me, I didn't lose my calling. I just really needed the break and to set better boundaries for myself, and recognize that there was some fear mixed in with like saying yes to everything, and that I had to, I always tell people, like, I couldn't plan being here. I couldn't have done this. Like, there was the universe in a way. This is how I see things. It's like action meets intention and what it is you're supposed to be doing, right? So, if there are dreams that you have and things that you want to do, people get destination, addiction, because they think it's about getting to that place, right? The big office in the corner. It's just about getting there. And it's not, life is not lived in that way, right? It's what it is you have to understand that you're not energetically a match yet for that corner office. And you have to go through all of the little big wins, because the littlest ones, I don't know about you, but I remember the tiny ones that felt like a switch flipped in my brain. Like I suddenly saw things completely differently. And that opened up so much more possibility. So you do the work, you show up, and then a door comes. And you get to go through that door, and then you do the more work and you show up, but you can't even know what door you're going to fully go. I mean, you have an idea, you're going on a direction, but you couldn't plan where you were going to be right now. If you were back in Australia thinking about moving to the US, and like, I'm sure everything had to evolve, but you showed up and you were fascinated and curious and interested. And you said, a lot of times I'll say, like, I want this to happen. This is what I see. But what I'm asking for is what I'm meant to do. What am I meant to have? Bring that. Because sometimes it's what you didn't want, but there's a message in learning it. Like, that's just telling you that way isn't the way. Go over here. Try this.
Yeah, you just covered, like, the podcast guests get to choose some questions out of a list I send them, and you just covered two of the questions that you didn't choose, but one of the questions on the thing is, in the last 5 years, what have you become better at saying no to? And the other one is, what do you think your true purpose is in the world?
Well,
go ahead.
Things build, right? Accelerate. Like when you're going to accelerate, like you don't just go from, we talk about 0 to 60, but there is a period between that, right? Things build. And, I call myself a self-described late bloomer. I was building the whole time, but things didn't come together until they came together, which was in my late 40s. Like I didn't, but my whole life had been building up to that, right? So what?
me too, late 40s, almost 50. And I was talking about this the other day with someone, and I said, have you ever seen Slumdog Millionaire? the movie. You ever seen the movie Slumdog
Yeah,
Millionaire? You know, so this Indian kid from the slums of Mumbai or whatever ends up on a game show, and he's got to answer these questions to, you know, it's Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and he's getting them all right, and there's no way a kid from the slums of Mumbai should know the answer to these things, and it plays back all these life experiences he's had that got him to that point. And it's kind of like that. It's kind of like you're playing Slumdog Millionaire, to where these random things that happened along during your life at the time, you didn't realize they were a piece of that bigger picture. Until you get to a certain point, you look back and you go, oh yes, like you said, I've been building all this time. I've been slowly getting towards this point I'm at now, which is just a point on the journey anyway. It's not like anybody's at the place, but you start to realize that, oh yeah, and that happened. And one of the questions you didn't choose too is, what's been your biggest failure and how has it helped you? But I guarantee you along the way there's been some failures that at the time were devastating, and looking back it's like, oh, that's what led me down, that's what said that's the wrong direction, you can't go in that direction, you've got to go in this direction. Yeah, you're answering all the questions without even
Well, here's the cool thing
them.
about failure is that I feel like one of the healthiest things we can do is own our life completely. You know, I believe, because it works for me, that our soul, our spirit, chooses the life before we're born for those challenges on the evolution of our soul, our spirit, right? This is part of our evolution. And, you know, hearing that can be very painful for people who have real severe trauma. But what I will tell you is that there is a shift that happens when you can look at your pain as a teacher, as a learning, as something that you can use to give back. That if you own it, like if my spirit chose this, then I may have been a victim to what happened, but my life is not victimized. How do I integrate that?
There's a moment in every podcast when someone says something so profound, the world stops. And that was it right there. Oh my God.
Well, how much different do you feel if it's like, oh, this pain, this hurt, this trauma was for me to figure out, how do I rise above it? How do I move past it? How do I integrate it? Not throwing it away and pretending it didn't happen, but how do I integrate it in a way that works for my calling, my life? Because maybe it's just that you have empathy. You have great empathy now for people. You know, some people actually, that's why they go into their whole career, is because they want to help other people in whatever way that they were affected. So I think making that choice. So, you know, when I look back at anything that was painful in my life, I struggle to call anything a failure, because I use every stupid mistake I ever made. I use all of my journey, all of the holes I fell in, as a way to connect with other people and have understanding of their experiences, because I have had so many of them myself. And I am not a person on high. I'm just a person on that path that may be a few steps ahead of you, and I may be able to reach my hand back and say, hey, I've learned some things because I'm a little further ahead that I think could really help you. And my hope is always that people get everything out of me that they can, like use it all up, and then they go on to find, something bigger in their journey to keep going.
To leapfrog ahead.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I can really resonate with that. I have this, I don't know if it's an internal argument, but I kind of know what I'm supposed to be doing, but I'm unsure. Do I not go so far down the rabbit hole as to not be relevant to a number of people anymore, or do I stand in the doorway and kind of go, hey, have a look in here, there's some cool stuff over here? So yeah, and I recently had a big old conversation with a group of very enlightened people about this, and they said, stop overanalyzing it, just do your work. Just shut up and do your job. Whatever happens will happen. I'm like, okay, yeah, I got to stop overanalyzing that.
Well, that's the anxiety piece, right? We're looking into the future and we're projecting onto it. Oh, maybe I won't be me anymore, right? Like maybe I won't be relatable. I'm going to be this other person. And I don't know if I want to be that other person, but I don't think that you, in the way that you're progressing on your journey, would ever, that's not going to happen. Like you're not going to be a different person. You'll always be you.
I think I got a meme here. I take screenshots of memes. And I saw one from David Bowie the other day. It said, aging is an extraordinary process where you become the person you always should have been.
Exactly. And I want to clarify a little bit about saying, yes, you will always be you. But I also think that as we evolve, right, it's that idea of, we have an idea of what we are moving towards, the best version of ourselves is, right? And then there's the version that we're living now. And every time we level up, the old you has to die. And I think that freaks people out because they want to be over here, but they're still holding on to this version because Kyle Cease has the best quote, and it says, "You're only afraid because you can measure what you would lose, but you can't see what you'll gain." You're only afraid because you can measure what you can lose. You can't see what you could gain.
Wow.
I mean, that was me, for sure. I mean, it's still me. I get addicted, though, to, like, throwing myself into things that I feel like I'm not ready for. And then, like, figure it out. Because it's always exciting. It's something always comes out of it that's fascinating.
You got me at a loss for words. Like the last 5 or 10 minutes has been too much wisdom for me. I'm just kind of, maybe it's all, I feel like maybe 6 months ago that would have been relatively profound, but right now it's a lot of that stuff's hitting me. Yeah.
It's funny,
You're good at your job, you know that?
Oh, thanks. Thanks. You know that poem I sent you?
Yes.
Yesterday. So that
Yes.
is by a woman named, I think, Araya Mountain Dreamer is her name. And she has a book called The Invitation that's all based on that poem. And she does workshops, and she was saying that at her workshop, she has people write down the 5 things that they want to let go of, and then they burn them, right? And it's this whole like ritual. And And she said that one of the women that was there said to her, well, I'm afraid that I am only with my husband because I value money and material things. And I'm afraid that we've lost whatever we once had. And she's like, and so, like, I don't know if I want to, like, so well, tell me that I'll be okay. Like, if I do this, if I write this down and we burn this, will I still be okay? Like, or will I, is this going to make me leave my husband? Like, what is this going to do? I think about that because I always think that people know. They already know what's not working, what's out of alignment, what that little tiny voice that keeps whispering, take that class, do that thing, move in with your parents, save up your money, do whatever it is, like that little thing. Mel Robbins talks about you have that little voice is the truth and you have 5 seconds to act on it. And if you don't, we just go, not right now, or I can't. So this woman wanted to do this transformational work, but she didn't want to be transformed because she was afraid, because that meant she had to show up for her own life. You talk a lot about the books that really impact you. And there is a book by Stephen Pressfield called The War of Art. And it is one of the most profound books because what he says is he believes that the universal fear that we all have, that is the most limiting fear, is that we are all terrified to show up completely for ourselves in our own life. And that's why we go to college and we major in the safe thing instead of the thing that we want. A lot of people that wanted to be in a band, they're A&R guys, and they're because they're close to what they wanted to do, but they held back. And it doesn't mean you have to do it for a living too. Like, it could be a hobby, like not everyone's going to be super uber successful in a band, but he talks about it and he gives an example. This is a trippy example. He said, Adolf Hitler, when his parents died, left him a small inheritance, and he wanted to be an artist. And he took that inheritance and he moved to Austria, and he went to art school. And he wasn't very good. Like to start with, let's say he didn't have any natural talent. And he was dejected and returned to Germany and eventually created World War II. And Stephen Pressfield's view is it was easier to start World War II than to be an artist, which was what he wanted. Because that's scarier, to show up and to do the work and to stay like, all right, I'm not very good, but like, let me keep working at it because this is really who I want to be.
Wow. That kind of reminded me of Howard Stern interviewed Ed Sheeran one time. Mm-hmm. And he said, and you were talking about, showing up and like not holding back sort of thing, like the A&R guy who wanted to be in music, but, at some point in time he pulled back. And Howard Stern asked, and the reason I know this story, I didn't listen to the interview. I was actually, a few years ago, I was in Canada and I was in a pickup with Jonathan Field.
Oh.
I think he was taking me to the airport, and Jonathan Field told me this story, but he said, Howard Stern interviewed Ed Sheeran, and he said, so, what was plan B? And Ed Sheeran said, I didn't have a plan B. Mm-hmm. Ed Sheeran said, I could name, I could hold my hands up and count to 10. I could name 10 other hugely successful musicians that didn't have a plan B. He says, and the reason they're successful is because they didn't have a plan B. Like they kept going basically when the going got tough. And the reason they got through the other side is because they didn't have a plan B. And we're always taught to have a plan B. You know what I mean? And it's so...
Play it safe. Be practical. Well, look, I'll say something else to that, too, is that I bet that Ed Sheeran would still be a musician and playing music and playing coffee shops, playing anywhere that he could, and maybe working a job to support himself if he didn't make enough, because that was what his calling, that was what lit him up, is being a musician. Elizabeth Gilbert, Elizabeth, she wrote Eat, Pray, Love.
Yes.
So she wrote a book called Big Magic.
Big Magic, one of my favorite books.
Oh my God, isn't it amazing? It's so beautiful. So you remember in Big Magic, one of the things she says is like, I made a pact with myself when I was 16 that I was a writer. But I never projected on to that love and made it responsible for me financially, because putting that together of like, oh, I have to be paid to be a writer to actually be a writer, and now I'm in my head about it because I'm like the business of writing and not. So she bartended, she was a ranch hand, she did all these experiential jobs, but she said, I never made my art pave my way. And I was happy because I was authentically me. And I think that that's true too, because maybe you do something for a living that you do enjoy, right? Maybe it's not your calling, but you do enjoy it and it makes you money. And the thing that you want to do is theater. Like you love do community theater, like do it, be involved, do that. It doesn't have to be something that financially supports you either.
Yeah, there's a story in Eat, Pray, Love that I sometimes will come up in conversations with people, but it's the one about, this is the craziest story. It's the one about where she was going to write this book and she had it in her head, and there was a family in Canada that have like oil fields, and there's the father and the son, and then there's a lady who's a receptionist in the
That's
business,
in Big Magic.
and the son goes to That's in Big Magic. The son goes to South America to look into exploring for oil down there, and he disappears. Yeah. And the father wants to go and find him, but he wants to keep running the business, so he's going to send the receptionist to South America to try to find this guy, and some big adventure ensues. And she has this, I'm going to write this book. I'm going to write this book. I'm going to write this book. She's got this idea, going to write this book. And at some point in time, she is at like a writers' conference or something or other, and she meets another writer who she's a fan of, who she's never met. I forget the lady's name.
Pratchett?
Is that who it is?
Something
and
like
so
that, yeah.
She's a fan of the other lady, and the other lady's a fan of hers. The other lady's read Eat, Pray, Love, and they meet and like, oh, I love you. And they give each other a big hug. And how you going? And they spend the weekend together at this writers' conference or whatever they're presenting at. Then they don't see each other for a couple of years in person, but they write letters back and forth and things like that. And the next time they see each other in person, Elizabeth Gilbert still hasn't written this book. And she says to the other lady, so what have you been up to? She goes, I've just written this amazing book. And Elizabeth Gilbert's like, so what's it about? She goes, well, it's about this family in Canada that has this oil business, and there's a secretary, and there's father and the son goes to South America. Then the secretary goes to try to find him because he gets lost. And it's exactly the freaking same book. And Elizabeth Gilbert goes, well, how long have you been writing that? She says, oh, well, the idea came to me roughly about the time that we met. And what Elizabeth Gilbert's saying in this thing is, the universe was telling her, here, write this book. And she kept saying, no, 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 no. Like in that hug where she hugged that lady, the universe said, well, I'm going to give it to her.
Yes.
And it was like,
Yes.
oh, that is the coolest story.
That is the coolest story. It would like give me chills. That one
And,
and the one about the poet who lived on the farm, and she said that when the poetry would come to her, it always came, from that magical place in the ethos, and it would, get downloaded basically into her. And she said she'd never know when she would be struck. And she was out in the fields one day, and all of a sudden, like, this amazing poem was coming to her, and she was sprinting back to the house to get back to her pen and paper. And she said it was like having a tiger by the tail. And when she got it down, it literally went down on the paper backwards because she was pulling it back. And she's dictating it backwards onto the page. Like, that's insane.
it's like someone had jumped out the window and you grabbed him by the foot and you were slowly dragging him back in.
Pulling him back in. Yeah.
I don't remember that in the book. But the other one I do remember is some famous musician talks about he'd written this song in his head and hadn't done anything with it. And one day he gets in, he flies somewhere, gets in a rental car and he's driving along and the song comes out on the radio. Someone else has pulled that song out of the universe and it was his song. But he had the idea and didn't use it forever. So we're like, screw it. And whoever it is, I think it was the same musician, could have been a different famous musician, was saying that his kids writes, and this is about non-attachment. He has his kids write songs, and then throw them away. Like,
do you have a Buddha board? Did you ever get a Buddha board?
No, what's that?
So I have a Buddha board here. So it's basically like a little easel and a paintbrush, and you fill the little base with water, and you draw on it with water, and you make some kind of beautiful design, and then as the water evaporates, the picture goes away.
Oh, so it's like the Buddhist sand painting things they do. Have you ever seen that?
No.
So the Buddhist monks will sit around and they get, it's coloured sand in their hand, and they'll let it sprinkle out the bottom, and they draw, and they're, from what I've seen, they're probably 3 or 4 feet square, and they spend like days doing this beautiful sand painting on the floor, like very, very intricate, and they're gorgeous. And they concentrate and they do it for hours and hours and hours. And when they create this beautiful piece of art, they don't take a picture of it. They don't do anything. They just walk through it with their feet and go and just turn it back into dust.
Wow.
Because it's non-attachment. You spent all this time doing this thing. You'd think you'd want to take a picture of it, show somebody, hang it on the wall or whatever. And they just, once they're done with it, they just erase it. Basically the same thing. Mm-hmm. Like, letting go of.
We were talking about all this like creative stuff, right? Artists and musicians and stuff. And I think it's really the thing I thought so beautiful about Elizabeth's book is that she's like, look, we're all creators. I don't care if you paint for a living or you're an accountant. We create life. And we create our own life. We are creative. You're creative. I'm creative. There's kind of that thing that we're told when we're young, like, oh, you're not good at that. You're not an artist, right? You try to draw and you're terrible. It's like, oh, that's not who you are. And that shuts down a really curious, creative, adventurous side of us, because then we dissociate from that part of ourselves and we deny it and we shut it down. And I mean, you could be creative with cooking. You can be creative with, there's so many, like the way you garden, the way I know what I'd love to do. If I could do this for a living, and you may see this already, but like, I love to put people together. Like, oh, you need to know this person or that. Like if I could just sit around and do that all day, I would love that.
Well, I've been on the receiving end of that, and thank you very much.
You're welcome. It's fun.
Oh my goodness, I could listen to your wisdom all day. But you know what? You mentioned a poem that you sent me yesterday, and I'm going to read it right now because I read it last night, and I'm like, wow. Who is this by?
So that is by Uriah Mountain Dreamer. She wrote a book called The Invitation.
So it says, I want to know if you can live with failure, yours and mine, and still stand on the edge of the lake and shout to the silver of the full moon, yes.
I'm going to interrupt you for a second. That's the second page. I sent you two.
Oh, I thought you sent me the same thing twice.
Nope. That's
oh,
the
okay.
page.
I was wondering why. Okay. Oh my goodness. Okay. I didn't read that one. I read the other one, and I was thinking, I must have skipped the first paragraph because it was this one. Okay. It doesn't, okay, in capital letters it says, it doesn't interest me what you do for a living. I want to know what you ache for, and if you dare to dream of meeting your heart's longing. It doesn't interest me here how old you are. I want to know if you will risk looking like a fool for love, for your dream, for the adventure of being alive. It doesn't interest me what planets are squaring your moon. I want to know if you've touched the center of your own sorrow, if you've been opened by life's betrayals or have become shriveled and closed from fear of further pain. I want to know if you can sit with pain, mine or your own, without moving to hide it or fade it or fix it. I want to know if you can be with joy, mine or your own, if you can dance with wildness and let the ecstasy fill you to the tips of your fingers and toes without cautioning us to be careful, to be realistic, to remember the limitations of being human. It doesn't interest me if the story you're telling is true. I want to know if you can disappoint another to be true to yourself, if you can bear the accusation of betrayal and not betray your own soul, if you can be faithless and therefore trustworthy. I want to know if you can see beauty, even when it's not pretty every day, and if you can source your own life from its presence. I want to know if you can live with failure, yours and mine, and still stand on the edge of the lake and shout to the silver of the full moon, yes. It doesn't interest me to know where you live or how much money you have. I want to know if you can get up after the night of grief and despair, weary and bruised to the bone, and do what needs to be done to feed the children. It doesn't interest me who you know or how you came to be here. I want to know if you will stand in the center of the fire with me and not shrink back. It doesn't interest me where or what or with whom you have studied. I want to know what sustains you from the inside when all else falls away. I want to know if you can be alone with yourself and if you truly like the company you keep in the empty moments. Wow.
Yeah.
I think I needed that right now. While I was reading that, I'm like,
It's so piercing.
It's also very appropriate
Beautiful.
for this podcast, for this particular conversation in the podcast, because so how you introduced Will to me was you share a celebrity client.
Yes.
You've also worked at I think it's like a rehab center in LA that has lots of celebrities there. And I was going to kind of bring that up. Mm-hmm. Not that you could mention or would mention their names, but I was going to kind of bring up the fact that, oh yeah, I'm talking to this lady and she's been around all these famous people. And then you've spouted out all this wisdom. And then I read that poem, and during that poem it says, who gives a shit? Mm-hmm. If the person on your podcast has met a lot of famous people.
almost kind of like what Jim Carrey says, I wish everyone could be rich and famous so that they could see it's not what you think it is.
That one and Mike Tyson. Anybody who thinks having a lot of money will make you happy ain't never had a lot of money.
I'll tell you what. When my work as a sober coach, the truth is that is something that mostly only affluent people can afford. It's because it's not covered under insurance. And one of the things that is very true is that if you think money, I always tell people, if you think money would buy you happiness, just hang out in Beverly Hills for a little while and tell me if the people that you run into are happy. And that's not trying to judge them. But what happens is what people don't understand is, like, especially if you don't have money, let's use money because everyone understands money, right? Money is energy. But if you don't have enough of it, it can be stressful. So if you feel like you're always paycheck to paycheck and that money could really change your life, then the idea of money grows, right? And you think, well, if I had money, man, all this would go away and things would be so much better. But what happens is as you make more money, your relationship to money changes. But if you had anxiety of money when you didn't have money, I want to tell you that you will have twice as much anxiety when you do have money, because now you're afraid of losing it. The fear around money, if you have fear around money, it doesn't go away by having more. And that is very apparent when you work with people who have a lot of money, because you think that I wouldn't have money as an issue that I have to think about anymore if I had it, and it becomes really the opposite.
I'm writing this down.
Okay.
Yeah, so there is a cut-off number I've read in a book somewhere, and it's like $78,000 a year in income.
I think if you don't live in LA, yes.
Unless
but double it for LA.
If you don't live in LA or San Francisco, like in the Bay Area like I live, I'm going to write this down. If you have fear around money,
it doesn't go away if you get more money.
It doesn't go away when you have more. But there is a point. So, in most of the US, I think it's $78,000, and maybe that book's a few years old. Whatever it is, there's a number.
Where it said those people are the happiest, right?
Well, it's not that those people are the happiest. Until you reach that, your happiness is a little dependent on money. Mm-hmm. But once you get to that point, no amount of money past that point makes you any happier.
More happy, right?
Yeah, you need to have, if you almost need to get to that point to where money is not affecting your happiness, but more of it. It's kind of like, I'm not sure if I think it was in Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, where he's talking about different things. He's talking about the word enough. Like, if you're going to play in the NBA, if you're 5'6", you're not tall enough. But if you're 6'4", you are tall enough. But the difference between 6'4" and 7'4", it's not 7'4" is not better than 6'4". Once you're tall enough,
yeah, all right.
More tall doesn't make you better in the NBA. But if you're 5'6", you're not tall enough to play in the NBA. And there's a cutoff point to where that's the threshold to where that's all the tallness you need. Now it's not tallness anymore. It's not height anymore that's going to help you out. There's some other intrinsic stuff.
And I really do believe that. So the reason that they had that 70-something thousand was that it was basically the idea that you have all the money for all of your bills, medical insurance, all that stuff, money to have a vacation, and enough money to have a bit of a savings. And that was kind of the bar. And I think that the reason why the happiness doesn't get more with more is because most people don't have a good relationship with money. We have so much projected onto money. Like, the idea that if we had, everyone has a number in their head that if they had that money, they're now the person that they don't like, right? Oh, they're the 1%, or they're, like there's a energy, like, or, maybe you were told, who do you think you are? Money doesn't grow on trees, it takes hard work, and, people with money are selfish. Are you selfish? There's so much. But if you look at it, like, if money is energy, I'm not looking to collect money. I'm looking to be a conduit for money, right? I'm looking because if I have a lot of energy coming my way, then I can put it towards charities, or the people in like, I can put my kid through a better school, and then look, then he's going to be a better, give more to society because of that. Like, it's how you see it. But if you think money and possessions will make you happy, it's only because you haven't had that amount of money and possessions yet. Like, it's like a dopamine hit. Like, buying something big, it gives you that woo, and then kind of like when you collect horses. Like, oh, that one's so pretty, I gotta have it. And then, oh, it's another mouth to feed. Another.
Right. Yes. I did a podcast early on in the podcast called Books That Have Influenced Me, and one was a little known book called Backbone. It's like a men's. Yeah, you look it up. It's I don't know how many copies in print, but it's basically a men's self-help sort of a book. And this guy says that most men spend all their life trying to attain 4 things at the same time. Like, if I could get these 4 things, I would be happy. Mm-hmm. Number 1 is material wealth. Number 2 is vocational success. Number 3 is health. And number 4 is love. So if I can have happy with my partner, I'm healthy, and I have money is not a problem. Like, if I want to do something, I can afford to do it, and vocational success. So I am the top of the food chain. I'm the CEO, whatever it might be. If I could, or whatever business you're in.
Yeah.
If I could get all 4 of those things, the reason I'm not happy is because I don't have all 4 of those things. And if I could only get all 4 of those things, then we come to the Jim Carrey quote. Mm-hmm. I wish everybody could be rich and famous so they know that it's not anything you'd want. And so this guy in the book says, once you get to that point, not many people get to the point where they have all 4 of those things. But once you get there, then you go, oh, shit, it wasn't that.
And now I don't even know what to reach for. Right. Now what do I do?
Right. Now what? Now, yeah. And so he says you got to have 3. Then you got to have 3 things. Once you get to that point, you realize there's only 3 things that are going to make you happy. Mm-hmm. Number 1 is you have to find and know your purpose. What?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
What are you doing here? Number 2 is you have to have a deep and authentic spiritual belief. Doesn't necessarily mean religion, mm-hmm. or whatever, but you've got to have a connection to something bigger than yourself that makes you feel small, basically. And then number 3 is you got to get rid of your bullshit. So those things. What's your purpose?
Number 3 is a lifetime. No, I just
number three is a bit of work, but yeah. Number 1, you got to figure out your purpose. Number 2, you got to have a deep and authentic spiritual belief, and number 3 is you got to get rid of your bullshit. And so that's unraveling all your traumas, and I think number 2 helps that a lot. Having a
I do
connection.
too. I think that one of the things I've run into with people who struggle with that is that a lot of people who struggle with that are people who have been really let down by people that were supposed to protect them in their life, who have been betrayed. And there's a commonality that they share, which is there's a part of them they want to believe, right? They want the idea that it's not just them out there, that there's other things working and supporting them, that the universe wants to support you. It wants to help you be that biggest version of you that you came here to be. But they're afraid because they don't want to be duped. They don't want to believe in something and then find out it wasn't true. And I always say, well, the only time you find that out is when you die. And when you die, you're not going to know. If it's not true, well, you don't know anything, right? But the truth is that people who believe in something are happier by far than people who don't. So if it doesn't really matter in the end, why not choose being happy?
Yeah. Robin and I so Robin's been working with this coach online for a while, and she's a bit of an everything coach, but she also does a lot of entrepreneurial coaching, and she's been working for a big entrepreneurial coaching company for like 15 years, and she's branched out on her own, and something she's starting to do is coaching entrepreneurial couples, because the dynamic in entrepreneurial couples is a little bit different than other couples. It's not that it's different, it has an added dimension to it. Mm-hmm. Okay, you've got all the same shit, plus there's some other things to it.
And I've been there. It's not easy.
So we've just done a 6-week course with her, but one of the things that she talked about is throwing money at a problem. Entrepreneurial, like entrepreneurs, when they start getting successful, they just think they can throw money at problems. And she said, there are problems you can throw money at. Mm-hmm. Like, get yourself a house cleaner, get yourself a gardener. Mm-hmm. You can offload a certain amount of stuff to somebody else. But then there's stuff that you can't offload to somebody else. You've got to do that work. And it's not mowing the lawn. You know what I mean? And it was interesting because it was a live Zoom call with 4 other couples or something or other, and you got to share some of your stuff if you wanted to. Like, she could always you could always elect not to, or she would mute the others, and you could just talk to her one-on-one. I don't think that ever happened in the whole 6 weeks, but yeah, it was really interesting, the dynamic. And but yeah, when you were talking about money a minute ago, I was just thinking about what she said about, a lot of times when you get money, you think that throwing money at problems is the solution to all problems, and it does make some of them go away, but others it doesn't.
It does not. It does not.
Wow, this has been such fun. This has been such fun. We've got to get to some of your questions here, and I've been writing notes, and I've turned my page over because the page I had your questions on, I've turned it over because I've filled the bottom of the page with my notes, so I've got to go back to you. So one of the ones you chose is, what is the luckiest thing that's ever happened to you?
Okay, well, so this one kind of ties into, I had a pretty traumatic young adult years that led to me being in a situation where I could have lost the rest of my life in my freedom. I could have lost that, and I remember being, so maybe I'm trying to figure out how to say this without opening a whole other story. But I ended up being with a much older man when I was a teenager, and he was not a great person, and he ended up being basically a criminal, and I was arrested with him when I was in my early 20s, and got kind of lumped in with all of his stuff. It's a long story, but I was facing 30 years in prison for all of the charges that they had. And I, they denied me bail, so I was moved to a lot of different little county jails and stuff. I was This is 30 years ago, right? And I remember talking to my grandmother on the phone. And I remember so clearly saying to her that, you know, I know it's awful that this happened, you know, and that I'm here, but I'm so grateful because this has been like getting a bucket of ice water dumped on my head, right? Because it's like I was living in a dream, and all of a sudden, like, I woke up like, oh, you're not a spectator in your life. You are the primary person. You need to start making choices and not just letting life happen to you like you're a child. And I said to her, I really think that if something so severe as this didn't happen, I could have been in that unconscious state for most of my life. And I think that started me on being so conscious. And believe me, I made a lot more mistakes, but it was like, no. And I remember when all of that was behind me, and I remember laying in bed one night, and it was the first time I felt like I could take a breath. And I had a very clear thought came into my head, which said, okay, you have two choices. You can be angry about all this that happened to you and what you were drug into. You can be angry, or you can live. But you can't do both. What one do you want to do? And I wanted to live. I had a second chance. I wanted to live. And I didn't have the education. I didn't have the support. I was a single parent. I had so much, but I was alive and I was free. And that was suddenly the greatest gift I could ever have. And that's why I say, like, failures, like, well, if you looked at me on like paper, if I was on paper, it'd be like, well, clearly this is one of the biggest failures, the choices that led you here. But no.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. So I'm going to go to the next one that everybody chooses.
Mm-hmm.
Because I imagine facing 30 years in jail, you would also be facing a lot of fear. What is your relationship like with fear now?
I look at fear as being transformational. It's, depending, obviously, like, you're getting robbed at gunpoint. That may not be the most transformational thing, but like the things that we fear in life being the most transformational. Like, okay, so when I got the job at that rehab, right? I mean, I was like, I worked on myself. My friends and I had done a documentary movie called American Street Kid about homeless youth in the U.S. And I was brought in later on in the production. I was one of the co-producers, and Michael Looney, my friend, who's basically the writer and director. And so because of that, I did all this research about the owner of the rehab, and I found an article where he said that what he would really love to do is to open a rehab for homeless kids. So, I did my research, and I went in and I had my interview with him, and we just connected, we talked, and then he hired me on the spot. And now inside, I am like Rocky on the steps. I am like, dun, 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 dun. You know, like I am jumping. I'm like, because I wanted the job so bad. I knew it was my job. I saw myself in it. I'm like, I know I can help. And so I'm still like all up here and all in my ventral vagal, right? This is great. And he goes, so we just need to like, can you do HR today? Can you go through? I'm like, yeah, sure, you know. And he's like, okay, just, you know, basic things, you know, like, you know, drug tests, there's a background check. And I was like, I felt the response, it was like being slammed to the mats. And then I went, oh, this is the thing. This is the thing that I've been afraid of my whole life. I've played small my whole life because I was so afraid that I would want something so bad. And someone would go, oh, no, that's not for you. You have this past, like, no. And here I am. And it's happening right now. And like, I mean, I had a headache. I was like sweating. Little did I know that they only go back 7 years. You know, like it was never coming up. But that was like, and I remember I went through the whole HR thing, and then I went back, and because they wanted me to start right away before like everything went through. And I thought like, well, that's just not in integrity. I can't do that. And so now I had to like, now I'm like shaking. I have to go up back to these people who thought it was so wonderful a few hours ago and sit down and be like, hey, you know, I had to plead guilty to a lot of things to get out of that situation, a plea deal, right? So, you know, I'm sitting across from the woman. I'm like, so I do have some things in the past. And she was like, well, okay, what, like a, you know, like a DUI and something? I'm like, not exactly. So, you know, I laid it all out for her. And then she's like, well, let me go talk to him. And then she goes and talks to the owner. And then she's like, okay, well, I think we're just going to see what happens and keep moving forward. And I'm like, okay. And as I was leaving, I see the guy going into another room. And he's just looking at me like, and I left there. And I, you know, it just kind of reaffirmed to me. It's like, you know what? If I don't get this, I have finally faced that fear. And I don't care if they hire me or not, because now without that, nothing's stopping me. That's it.
You shed that thing. Yeah. At the start of that, you said something about, you know, you shouldn't be afraid of fear or whatever, and you should, unless you're getting robbed at gunpoint. And it just reminded me of a story. So I was listening to a Tim Ferriss podcast with a guy named Boyd Varty. And Boyd Varty is a South African safari guide that has an amazing story. He's got a couple of amazing books. But he told a story.
Oh, I remember this. Yes. It's really good.
He told a story in that thing to where they had a house in Johannesburg, I think his parents did. And they were staying there, him and his mother and his sister were staying there, and he woke up one morning with a gun in his face. And these three guys had broken into the house and tied up his mum and his sister, and they wanted to know where the money was. And he basically said to them, like, there's no money here. And they lost it. They were furious, and they drug him downstairs, and they had him kneeling in the driveway, and they were about to kill him. They were going to shoot him in the head in the driveway, which is not unusual in some places in South Africa. And he said that at that very moment, he kind of looked this guy in the eye, and he said this peace came over him. And he just kind of released to the universe. He just kind of let go. And at that moment, the guy with the gun kind of got this startled look on his face, like he had just woken up somewhere. He didn't know where he was. And he looked at his two friends, and they looked at him, and he looked at the gun in his hand. He looked at Boyd Varty kneeling on the ground. They kind of looked around, and it was like they'd just woken up there and like, how did we get here? Mm-hmm. And he said something to Boyd Varty like, I need to go, but I don't know when can you get inside? My car keys are inside. Can you go get them? So Boyd Vardy gets up, goes inside, gives the guy his car keys, and he drives off. And I was talking on the weekend to some people about this, like, is there parallel universes running concurrently to the one we're in, and just the choice we make, you skip from one to the other. Like, this guy was about to pop Boyd Vardy in the head, and then all of a sudden, Boyd Vardy, it's like a test. It was like, and he let go, and it's almost like you skip to a different channel, and these three robber guys kind of look at each other like, what are we doing here? But all the intention of what they're going to do and everything just went away, and it's like, I think that's one of the trippiest stories I've ever heard in my entire life. But is it that trippy?
But don't you have moments like that in your own life that maybe aren't on that scale?
Oh, I had one on that scale.
Did you? Oh, really?
At the time, looking back now, I don't want to say that's what happened, but I think that's what happened. Like, I made a choice, and we skipped tracks on the CD of life and went to another track. Yes, and it was very similar to that, but I hadn't ever looked at it that way until I heard that Boyd Vardy podcast. And when he said that, I'm like, oh, shit. If anybody's ever heard the story that I've told on the podcast about the gas station late at night in Michigan, there was a point where that guy reached around behind him, like he was reaching into the waistband of his pocket, of his pants, with his hand. And in that story I told, like right then, instead of, I've always had a freeze response in scary situations, never a fight response. But I didn't have a fight or a freeze response. I had a, okay. So this is how it happens. And then his hand came out from behind him with nothing in it. And at the time, when I first told the story, when I told the story in the podcast, I said, I thought he must have had an itchy ass or something or other. But after listening to that Boyd Vardy podcast, was like, was that a test? And you can only really speculate, but anyway, that's.
Do you know what I think sometimes? Sometimes I wonder if that's what, if you want to say God, Spirit, Source, your angels just flooding into your body and holding you. Because that knowing, that just completely clarity almost, it almost feels otherworldly. Like you're connected to something, you're getting that from somewhere. Because you couldn't choose it. I mean, how could you actually choose it? I mean, you can set yourself up for it because all the work you've done, right? But like, I don't know. There's something magic about it.
Oh, there was something magic about that whole thing before I listened to the Boyd Vardy podcast. And then there was like, oh my God, there's another layer to whatever hell that happened that night. So, yeah. Okay, I'm going to ask you another question. Message. What is your, if you could send a message to the world, one that they would listen to, what would that message be? Or your favorite quote? That's the question. Or it could be both if you want to.
Yeah, I really love that quote. Gosh, I wrote it down too. But it was, damn, I forget. So, but the quote is George Bernard Shaw quote, where, there's a line in there that says, I want to be thoroughly used up when I die. And I love that quote because I think that life is just a big adventure. And I want to experience as much of it as possible. And I want other people to feel free to explore their life as well. And I believe that if you could cultivate one thing, if I had one piece of advice, become curious about what makes you you. I think that's the starting point. Become curious about, don't judge, right? If you're highly reactive, if you get, not judging, why? Why? Would I choose that reaction if I wasn't activated? No, I have shame around that part. So you're not choosing it. So why is it there? Who put it there? Did you put it there? Somebody else put it there? What does it do for you? Do you feel like you have to shut people down way harder than they come at you so they don't hurt you again? They don't even try that. But then you push people away and you don't have connection. So become curious. That's the start of all of it. That's the string that you pull.
I feel like this. I feel like the whole time I've been talking to you today, you've been talking about me. Not necessarily, it's about me, but I mean, all this stuff is resonating with me so much. I've had some experiences recently, and it's almost like we scheduled this podcast for today because I needed to hear everything you're saying right now. And 2 weeks ago, it wouldn't have said the same thing as it's saying today.
Can I add one thing to that?
Sure.
When I talked about things that we always have those moments when someone says something or we read a quote and it changes us. And one of the things was a friend of mine, I had told my whole story to this person who was a friend, a really deep friend, and she had another friend there. So it was two people. And one of them looked at me and they said, wow, that's a lot. He said, you're a real survivor. And I remember thinking yes, I survived all that. I'm a survivor. That's how I see myself. Keep going, keep going, keep going, right? And she said, well, the only problem with being a survivor is that you keep having to create situations to survive, to be able to show your skills. She said, I choose to thrive in my life. And that moment rewired my brain, I swear to you, because of a lot of my childhood and growing up, I never viewed thriving as something that was a choice for me, right? That was what the kids who grew up in the good homes with the loving parents and the dog and the car and the vacations and did all those things. That's thriving for them. That's obvious. But that's a choice that I can choose. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wrote down, be a thriver, not a survivor.
Well, it's true. We keep making situations where we can survive them because that's where, it's what you focus on, you create, right? So if I identify as a survivor, I'm focusing on the world being a place that I need to survive. So the world's going to show up as a place that has chaos, and I'm going to need to keep showing my skill at being able to survive it. You see that quote by Wayne Dyer all the time, right?
And you change the way
You
you look at
change the
things.
way you look at things, the things you look at change.
And it's funny, I've had a lot of those actually on the podcast. I had, when Jane Pike told me that, that the freeze response when I needed it was there to help me. It was my best friend. It was not the enemy. And so, from then on, I stopped judging the freeze response that I'd had, as a child and, further back. I kind of totally changed the story about my relationship with it. Like, with my relationship with that past freeze response, I was no longer looking at it negatively. I was looking at it like, hey, that was something I needed at the time. I can let go of that now, but at the time I needed it, and it was the right thing at the time. Mm-hmm. There's been I've had a few of these on the podcast. I think I'm having one today, actually. Okay, what other questions did you have? You picked a question that no one else has picked in the entire, I don't know how many podcasts we're up to now. We're in the high 80s or early 90s or something or other. No one else has picked this question. And when you told me the question, you read the question out to me, I'm like, that's not one of my questions. And then I looked it up, and it is one of my questions. It says, do you have any regrets that you'd be willing to share with the world? And what did you learn from those regrets?
I think I was attracted to that question because I have had a relationship with the term regret. And the thing about the word regret that I like to reframe is because to me, the term regret implies that I am still stuck in some way internally at something in the past that happened that I can't accept that it happened. And I have made choices in my life, and I say that even when I incorporate, even when I was a teenager, when someone say, well, you were a child, but I made choices in my life, and those choices have hurt people that I love the most and care about. And in the classic term of regret, like, they would be the things that you would say, well, do you regret those choices? But I can't change the way time works. And they happened. And so I have to accept that they happened. I have to make amends where I can. But I have to find also how it's part of my story, of my path. Are you familiar with the idea of the hero's journey?
Yeah, Joseph Campbell.
Yeah, we all are on our hero's journey. We're all the protagonists of our own story. And we all go down, right? We all fall so that we have the opportunity to rise. And when you do that, that's why we always cheer, right? Everyone recognizes that in the other, right? You recognize that struggle. And when you're rising, that's the part that people really connect to. It's kind of like when Brené Brown talks about, vulnerability being viewed as courage. It feels like awful, like I'm dying. I'm exposed, I'm weak. But it looks like courage to most people. Like we love that about you, that you say that. We love that makes me sit further in my chair. We all have a hero's journey. We have to, and it's about owning it and not trying to change it or fix it. We just have to understand that it's part of it. That's what I've done for myself. It's helped a lot.
Wow. Well, we have one more question. And we've been talking for almost 2 hours and it's just zoomed by.
I can't believe it.
And the one question is, what quality do you admire in other people? What quality do you admire most in other people?
Accountability. I think it takes a lot of courage, the most courage, to be accountable, to be able to admit when you made a mistake, to not project or blame or dodge. And it's one of the core tenets of being a good leader too, and a trustworthy person, is if you're accountable. Not with beating yourself up and judge, no self-flagellation, but just being able to listen and hear, understand, show up.
There's been a lot of silences like that little one right there in this podcast because you've just, oh my goodness, you've blown me away. You know, what I like to do in the podcast is figure out what people do, that it's usually interesting and it's not a normal line of work, and it's kind of something people would like to hear the story about. People would like to know how you got there, and I would like to know how you got there, and that was what I was planning to do today, but we didn't even go anywhere near unraveling your story because you just had so much wisdom to share that is like, oh, this is not about how did you get from point A to point B. It's basically you're just sharing the wisdom you've learnt along that way without giving any details about where you were living and what job you were doing, like that poem. I don't care what you do for a living. That poem was... Yeah, that poem spoke to me, even though I read it last night. I didn't read the second page of it last night because I thought that you'd sent me the same thing twice. Oh, wow, what an amazing conversation. Thank you so much. It's been awesome. So if people want to...
So this has been
people
wonderful.
Want to know more,
fun.
Sorry, if people want to know more about you, how do they find out more about you?
Well, the easiest email address I have is onthepathequine@gmail.com. My website is ravensunranch.com, sun being S-U-N. And on Instagram @ravensunranch.
Wow. Well, I just can't thank you enough for coming on here today. This has been one of the most amazing conversations I think I've ever had in my entire life. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I have had so many conversations with you already in my head. So, I mean, there's not a single podcast that you do that I'm not like, oh, I did that too. I saw that too. I read that too. I heard that too. That's so cool.
Yeah, I just spent 4 days in Oregon at former podcast guest Stevie Delahunt's place doing a boot camp for the Gaucho Derby. So I'm going to do the Gaucho Derby in Argentina, and I went up there and did a boot camp. But what was really interesting is the other people in the boot camp. It seems like those challenging things like that attract a certain type of people. Like, have you read this book? Oh yeah, I've read that book. I mean, It was just like, yeah, people that are fully on the path, as your email says, on the path, equine.com. Yeah. Oh wow. So yeah, we better cut it off here. I got looking at the time at about 1:30, an hour and 30, and I thought, oh, I could go. This could go on forever. So I think we're just going to cut it off there and let people sit and marinate in the wisdom you've had to share. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
And for you guys at home, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll catch you on the next episode of the Journey On podcast. And for those of you who are on the Patreon group, we're going to get the conversation after the conversation.
Oh, I didn't even know there was that.
Oh, yeah, no, I forgot to tell you about that. So, well, I think you told me a story the last time we were together that I was completely blown away by it, and I was wanting you to actually tell me that story on the podcast, but then as it got going, you were just coming out with so much wisdom, like, oh no, let this sit here, and I know what story you're going to tell us for the Patreon group. So you were telling me about something called constellation therapy. Is that what it's called?
Yes. I think that, yeah, constellation. We've always shortened it to constellation. Do you do a constellation? But yes, it's, and it can be called family constellation, but yeah, the constellation work, and it kind of ties into when you said earlier, like, I think about, do I go further and further on this journey, and will I be able to recognize myself? Will I be relatable to people, right? And I guess this is kind of my piece of that kind of feeling too. But yeah, I told you about that. Did you look it up?
I did look it up, and when you said a minute ago family constellation, I'm like, yeah, that's what I found. So you were working at Passages at the time, weren't you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So where my office was, there was a marriage and family therapist across from me, Denise, and then my friend Lisa Cefalou, who is also a clinical hypnotherapist. And the three of us, they coined the term the three witches for us, because we operated in different ways, but I think we all work on an intuitive level.
Excuse me, I'm going to interrupt you.
Yeah.
So for you guys listening, I will talk a little bit about this now. So this was at Passages. So this is the big time where all the famous people go, rehab place in. Is this in Malibu? Is it Passages Malibu?
Malibu, yeah.
So if you're interested in know, if anybody thinks it would be interesting, look up what famous people have been to Passages Malibu. You'll see that, or look up Passages Malibu. It's a kind of a famous sort of a rehab center. But sorry, just wanted to set the scene so they know
of course.
what you're doing. So you and the three witches.
Yes. So Lisa is trained in doing constellations, and Denise was fascinated by them and went to get training. And I had never done them, and they would try to explain to me what it was about, like where people like represent other people to you, or and you do this kind of like group thing.
So you actually explain it to me, like, so someone is doing the therapy, like it's their work, and there's a group of people there, and they choose those people in the room to represent someone in their life. Could be their father.
So that's the
mother,
real thing that happens. Yes,
right.
That exactly. That's the real thing. Because I'm saying, like, I didn't have a full understanding when they asked me if I would be a part of it, and then I got the full understanding. But yes, in that therapy, the person that's having it done, if you're getting your constellation, there's other people in the room, and you assign to the people. Maybe they represent your mother, maybe they represent your shame, and then the process begins. So what happened was is that they said, oh, there's somebody who works here who really wants to do a constellation, so some of us are going to get together next Tuesday after work, and Lisa's going to lead the constellation for them. Do you want to experience it? Do you want to try it? And I was like, sure. And then I kind of forgot about it because like a week away or 2 weeks away. And then the night before, I get a text message from Lisa saying, hey, just, letting everyone know that, be sure you eat something tomorrow and, relax, and we're going to meet here. And it was the oddest thing, because I read this message and threw my phone across the room. Like, I threw it down. And I
so
had
what,
this,
did you have like a huge visceral reaction or something?
Yes, it was like a visceral reaction. Almost like the only way I could describe it is like if you went into an instant temper tantrum that you agreed to do something that now you didn't want to do. Like it was just like this, like visceral, like energetically, I don't want to do that. But I didn't even understand. I was like, what's wrong with me? So next day I go to work. Now next day I'm thinking this is going to be interesting, right? This whole constellation thing. Now I had a full schedule of clients all day. And as the day is going on, there's a buzzing that starts in my body in the sense of like, if you ever drank a little too much caffeine, where like that, it was that kind of feeling. And I was like, maybe I need to eat something, and as the day progressed, it just started getting worse and worse to where like my hands were shaking. I was feeling a little lightheaded. And after my last client, everyone was gathering outside my office in this little common area. And I peek out of my office and I catch Denise's eye. I'm like, hey, come here. So she comes over into my office and I'm like, I don't know what's happening to me. I'm like, my whole body is like, I don't know if I can do this. Am I having a panic attack? Like, what's happening? And she, Denise loves anything crazy. She's like, got this little smirk. And she was like, oh, she said, once you agree to be a part of the constellation, that's when it begins. And I was like, get out of here with that crazy voodoo stuff, right? Like, I was like, no. This is freaking me out right now. And so she just starts giggling and laughing, going, come on, it's going to be fine. So we all go into the room. And I am at this point holding myself like this. And I'm just trying to contain the feeling of like I'm going to vibrate out of my body. And so Lisa starts the whole process. And part of it is, calling up your ancestors and it's like this very, it's really like trippy introduction. And then she had the person that was getting it done choose who she was going to have represent her. And she ended up choosing me. And I'm just sitting in this chair vibrating and trying to stay sane. And at one point in the work, Lisa says to her, I want you to look at Christine, right? Look at you. And I want you to say, it's okay. I love you. And she says that. And I think I said to you, it was like in The Exorcist when she's like vomiting the pea soup. It was like something came from deep down in my gut, in my stomach, and just came flying out. And I was, ugly crying, sobbing, just like moaning and
But you weren't vomiting. This was a noise or an energy.
No. This was energetically like it just came flying out of this like just horrible grief and pain. And I was just crying. And then at one point it was like almost like when you turn off the water on your spigot, it just was like done. And I was exhausted and freaked out. And afterwards, I think I told you this afterwards, like Lisa and Denise come running up to me and they're like, oh my God, like I've never seen anyone channel like that before. Did you know you could do that? Did you? And look, like, I believe in all that stuff. Like, I really do. Like, I'm fascinated by. But at that time, that was not who I saw myself as. Like, I'm the grounded one. I'm grounded. I'm in this world. I'd like to use the other, but like, I'm here. And I looked at them and I was like, I just want you both to know that I will never be doing that again. I don't know what just happened to me, but if one of your questions was, what is the trippiest thing that has ever happened to you that you have no ability to explain or understand, it would be that.
And so was it just sobbing, or was there a scream, a roar, a yell?
It was like a ah, like cry, but this just was crazy time. But like it was. I mean, you asked me this question when I told you the story before about did I get anything out of it?
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that when I said I was exhausted after it, I do think that on some level, when you work with people that have a lot of trauma, and a lot of people who suffer from addiction have a lot of trauma, and you hear stories that some of them are just so heartbreaking that you wish you didn't know that stuff happens, and I think you pick up a little of that energy, and I think that was a real. I mean, I don't think I had anything left in me after that. It really cleansed all that away.
So it was. What about the person who was doing the constellation? Did you talk to her about it afterwards?
You mean that it was getting it done? No.
Yeah. No.
I didn't know her very well.
Okay.
And yeah, no.
Like the picture, when you told me the picture I was getting, it was like the guy in the Mummy movie where the scarab beetles just flow out of his mouth.
Yeah, that's what it felt like. Yes. Like that intense. It's just really one of the trippiest things very trippy. But, super cool. But.
And, you said I'm the grounded one, and I didn't know I could do that. Do you think that experience changed your perception of you at all?
It definitely challenged my perception of me. I had a hard time integrating that experience. I mean, I feel like I can do that for myself, right? Like, because if it's just like we can all like be fascinated by our own intuition and the little things that come to us. I think we all have those moments, but it's a whole different thing to present yourself as that person, right? Like, let's say like you got a lot of intuitive information that you used in your own life, but it's different if you're like, I'm an intuitive and people can come to me and I'll tell them about their lives. Like that's a whole, or this is who I am. So I had a really hard time with trying to figure that piece out for myself. And where I kind of left it at was, it was fascinating, very interesting. There's obviously some things that I can explore more, and maybe my journey will lead to more of that. But I didn't feel called to it at that time.
And you haven't really explored it yet? No. Does it, are you curious? Or does that kind of scare you a little bit?
But that's where I can...
that's got to be like having something like that, like this huge, big old energy come out of you that you didn't even know was there. It's almost like when you have that realization that it's almost like the ego death, like to where you have that realization that this physical form that you have right here is just a bit of a facade about what's really going on. And that's a very scary place to be when you... I think it's just... I haven't let go of it yet. So, yeah, it's a scary place to be. I just wondered if yeah.
Well, when you said, like, about going down your journey and will I still be me, like, that was... And that's why I say, like, I wasn't ready for that at that time. And I have no idea if it will be part of my future journey or not. I imagine it probably will in some way, shape, or form. But at that time, I couldn't integrate, like, who that person was with the version of me I was in that time.
Yeah, powerful stuff. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I
Yeah.
hope you guys listening at home got as much out of that story as I did the first and the second time, but that's powerful stuff. Oh, once again, thank you so much for joining me, and thanks for sharing that. You guys at home, the Patreon members, thanks so much for being a Patreon member, and I hope you guys are enjoying these little end snippets as much as as I am. Anything else you'd like to tell some people before we finish up here, Christine?
I'm just really grateful for this. This has been part of my own journey, just being on here, because so much of my life I created around being unseen, like operating under the radar for a lot of reasons. So it was a big step for me in my path that this showed up, and what better person for it to do it with than you? I mean, this has been a breeze, fun.
Oh, I had a blast, and I'm going to have to. This is one of those podcasts that as soon as Tyler gets it all put together, I'm going to have to listen to it again and take some more notes, because I think it really helped me integrate some of my more recent experiences. So thank you so much.
That's awesome. That's great.
Thanks, guys, for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode of the Journey On podcast.